Have you ever wondered how Queen Elizabeth spent her last day? Not the version wrapped in headlines or ceremony, the real one, silent, dignified, and hidden behind the ancient stone walls of Balmoral Castle. The kind of day history doesn't announce until it's already over. The kind of moment that drifts past without fanfare, yet changes the course of an entire nation. When we imagine the final hours of a monarch who reigned for 70 years, we picture processions and public mourning. But that's not how it happened, not for her. Instead, it began with a grey sky over the Scottish Highlands, the kind of mourning too quiet to feel significant, unless you knew what to listen for. Balmoral has always been the Queen's true sanctuary, not Buckingham Palace, not Windsor. Balmoral, a remote estate tucked away in the Heather Hills, where royalty could finally breathe like ordinary people, where dogs roamed the halls, where staff were more like family, and where the monarchy's weight seemed just a little lighter. On the morning of September 8th, 2022, that sanctuary turned into something else entirely, a place of passage, a final threshold. The Queen woke slowly, they say. Her staff, the innermost circle, moved gently, sensing a shift in rhythm. She had been ill. That wasn't a secret, but the way she looked that morning, pale, soft-spoken, distant, was different. Not sick, exactly, just quiet in a way that felt permanent. Nurses were nearby, but not rushing. The royal physician had already been briefed. Her children had been contacted, and yet no one said what was truly happening, not out loud. In those first hours there were no declarations, no emergency, just a kind of stillness that grew heavier with every minute. And still, the outside world knew nothing, because death, for a monarch, doesn't happen the way it does for the rest of us. It happens in stages, in whispers, in tightly choreographed silence. And on that day, silence was everywhere. The hallways of Balmoral echoed softly. Her beloved dogs were kept in a separate wing. Her dresser stood beside the bed, offering the same gentle care she'd given for decades, brushing the Queen's hair, smoothing the bedclothes, adjusting the room's lighting. This wasn't procedure. This was reverence. Balmoral has always held a different kind of magic. There are no grand fountains, no sweeping marble staircases, just stone, history, simplicity. And that morning, those walls absorbed a kind of goodbye that would take hours to be spoken. Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are right now? Let us know in the comments. It's always moving to see how far these moments travel. And if you find comfort in slow, reflective history told with care, gently consider subscribing. These quiet stories matter, even when they're almost never told. Now, back to Balmoral. Staff close to her say she remained calm, alert, even smiling faintly at times. A light breakfast, a visit from the chaplain. The moment was coming, and she seemed to understand. Some believe she had known for days. Others say she had made peace even earlier, in the summer months, when she insisted on staying in Scotland longer than usual. There were small signs, letters finalized, old friendships rekindled, subtle goodbyes tucked into ordinary conversations. She had lived long enough to know when the season was changing, not outside, but inside her. Her children began arriving. Anne was already close by. Charles was on his way. The others rushed through airports cloaked in secrecy, but they would not all make it in time. Time, in those moments, moved strangely. For the world, it was an ordinary day. For the crown, it was the last breath of an era. No press release had gone out. No black cars lined the street. And yet, something massive was already unraveling. For decades, Queen Elizabeth had stood as the one constant. Through wars, political storms, pandemics, royal crises, she had become less a person and more a symbol of steadiness, tradition, and the quiet power of duty. And now, That symbol was fading, not publicly, not ceremonially, but privately, gently, in a place where cameras weren't allowed. The announcement would come later, carefully timed, strategically worded, but in that room, the truth had already arrived. Her breathing slowed, her grip loosened, and then nothing, not a gasp, not a final word, just stillness. Balmoral did not erupt in alarm. There was no sound of rushing feet, only a quiet protocol, practiced for decades, now set into motion. The royal standard would remain raised for hours. The gates would not close, and the staff would wait, not for grief, but for orders. Operation London Bridge had begun, but not in London. In the hills of Scotland, it started with closed doors, hushed corridors, and the quiet removal of a tray untouched. In London, journalists scrambled. Officials stalled. Phones rang with instructions wrapped in coded language. Because when a monarch dies, the world is not allowed to feel it all at once. It must be measured, controlled, unfolded in perfect symmetry. But for the few who stood beside her, those final few, nothing about it was controlled. It was heartbreak. It was sacred. It was real. She did not die on a throne. She died in a bed, covered in wool, surrounded by people who loved her not as queen, but as Elizabeth, grandmother, mother, friend, and with her last breath, an entire generation of history closed, not because she commanded it, but because she simply was it. She had become the map by which time was measured, and now, without her, time itself paused. The rest of the world would catch up hours later, but for those in Balmoral, history had already changed, quietly, completely, forever. What came next didn't feel like history being made. It felt like time trying to understand itself. The news hadn't been released yet, and for a few hours, there was a strange stillness across Britain, a tension you could feel but couldn't name. Some members of Parliament were pulled from meetings without explanation. Buckingham Palace issued vague updates, and on the news, anchors began wearing black. But no one said why. The world kept refreshing its feeds, watching cars arrive at Balmoral, watching the windows for a curtain shift, for a hand to wave, for anything. But Balmoral stayed still, and that stillness, somehow, said everything. Behind those stone walls, the family had begun gathering in full. Charles had arrived, Camilla beside him. Anne had stayed close through it all. Andrew and Edward were coming. William was trying to get there. Harry would come later, alone. The Queen's death was still unannounced, but inside the estate, grief had already taken its place in the room. Some say Charles went for a short walk, alone. Others say he simply stood in silence. There was no formal declaration yet, but those closest to the moment had already begun the quiet work of shifting into a world without her. It's a strange thing to mourn someone publicly before the world is even told, but that was the burden of the crown, to grieve as a son and prepare as a king. Meanwhile, the public stared at their screens, their phones, the live shots of Balmoral's gates. Reporters speculated in gentle tones. Crowds grew outside Buckingham Palace, bringing flowers for a woman no one had confirmed was gone, and still, no one knew for certain. That day, the timeline moved in slow motion. At 12:32 p.m., a medical concern was quietly stated. At 2:39, Prime Minister Liz Truss was informed that the Queen had died, but the world would not hear those words until after 6:30 p.m. For 4 hours, one of the most important facts in modern British history was held in silence, not by accident, by design, because this was not just a death. This was a moment orchestrated for decades. Operation London Bridge, a code name known only to officials, rehearsed in secret, ready for execution at the exact moment history stopped. But the Queen didn't die in London, so Operation Unicorn was activated. the plan for if she passed away in Scotland. Trains were halted, flights redirected, Parliament was frozen, and yet, to the public, everything still looked the same. That was the genius and tragedy of it. A world-altering moment, hidden in plain sight. Inside Balmoral, the Queen's body lay at rest, draped in the royal standard, in a room with no cameras, no broadcast, just quiet. Her staff stood by. Some prayed, others simply wept. But the news still hadn't come, and in those hours, people everywhere felt a discomfort they couldn't explain, as if the air itself was holding its breath. When the announcement finally came, it arrived not with fireworks or royal decree, just a press release, short, controlled. Buckingham Palace confirms the Queen died peacefully this afternoon at Balmoral Castle. No adjectives, no elaboration, just the fact. And with it, the world tilted slightly, not because we didn't expect it, but because the one thing we thought might never change, just did. In homes across Britain and around the world, people cried without knowing why. She had been a fixture in the background of so many lives, on stamps, on coins, on television, in memories. She had always been there, until now. Outside Balmoral, the gates filled with flowers. Strangers hugged. Reporters stopped speaking mid-sentence, choked by emotion. And across 56 countries of the Commonwealth, from Canada to Australia to Jamaica, church bells rang and flags were lowered. London Bridge had fallen, but in Scotland it had started with a whisper. What followed was history, but not the kind taught in schools. It was human. It was slow. It was the sight of a hearse driving through villages, past crowds who stood in silence. It was people removing their hats, lowering their heads, as the Queen passed by one last time. It was Charles walking behind the casket, his face caught between son and sovereign. It was a new reign beginning in the shadow of an ending. But none of that could have happened without those first hours of silence, that deliberate pause, that sacred moment where the world waited and didn't know why. Because in a monarchy, as in life, endings are not always loud. Sometimes they begin in a quiet room in Scotland, with no audience, no speech, just a woman, a life, a final breath, and everything that comes after. When the Queen passed, the official machinery of the monarchy didn't miss a beat, but the people inside it felt everything. In those first hours after her death, palace staff moved with solemn precision, carrying out rehearsed procedures that had lived on paper for decades. The Queen's senior dresser, Angela Kelly, once her confidant and close companion, was nowhere in the public eye, but it's widely believed she stayed nearby, quiet, composed, watching history shift without ceremony. Every staff member knew their place, and yet nothing could truly prepare them for the weight of what was unfolding. The royal household, often hidden behind titles and uniforms, was suddenly a grieving family. For them, she wasn't a symbol. She was a daily presence. She had routines, jokes, small habits that won't make history books, but shaped their lives. Her corgis sensed something was wrong. Animals always do. Her last walk with them had been quiet. The staff who had worked with her for decades knew those final hours weren't about politics or pageantry. They were about presence, about stillness, about the small dignity of letting go. But outside Balmoral, the larger machine had already begun to turn. Protocols kicked into motion. Phone lines burned with quiet urgency. A plan had existed since the 1960s for how to announce her death, but nothing could choreograph the emotions now spilling through the public. In cities and villages across the UK, people gathered without being told. In pubs, the music stopped. In classrooms, teachers paused their lessons. Television screens faded to black. News anchors, some visibly shaken, read the announcement with trembling hands. No breaking graphics, no triumphant music, just solemn faces, soft lighting, and the weight of knowing this moment would be remembered forever. Meanwhile, Balmoral remained sacred ground. a fortress of grief wrapped in trees. The Queen's children took turns by her side. Charles, now King Charles III, already bore the crown and title, but not yet in emotion. He had lost his mother, and in those hours, long before proclamations and addresses, he was simply a man at the edge of both personal and national transformation. What do you say in that moment? To yourself? To your family? To history? There is no right sentence. There's only breath. The quiet realization that one chapter is over and the next has no roadmap. Camilla stood nearby, silent, supportive. Anne, always steady, stayed close. The brothers arrived later, William grieving not only the monarch but the grandmother who once told bedtime stories. Harry, separated by both distance and decades of tension, came too late to say goodbye. That detail would linger in headlines, but the moment had already passed. Death does not wait for reconciliation, and neither does legacy. Within Balmoral's quiet halls, the Queen lay in state, not in the way London would later see, not draped beneath the soaring arches of Westminster, but in a quiet Scottish room where the walls held more stories than cameras ever could. Her doctors stepped away. The chaplain stayed behind. There was no official moment when she became history, but the air itself seemed to shift. The castle, ancient and cold, carried her memory like a final breath. Outside, the public waited and waited, and when the hearse finally emerged, it did not feel like a procession. It felt like a goodbye whispered across countryside roads. Locals lined the streets, some in silence, others sobbing quietly. Children waved small flags. Farmers stood at attention in muddy boots. A shepherd raised his cap as the car passed his field. It was ordinary, profoundly ordinary, and in that ordinariness, it became sacred. Scotland gave her a farewell unlike any spectacle London could ever create. Raw, unsymbolic, human, because before she was a monarch, she was a person, and this was her final ride home. The car traveled for hours, from Balmoral to Edinburgh, escorted not by grand parades but by stillness. People pulled over, stood outside their cars, put their phones away, just watched, because sometimes witnessing is all you can do. No one cheered, no one clapped. They simply looked, one last time, at the woman who had been their queen and their constant, and now their loss. In Edinburgh, the coffin entered the palace of Holyrood House. Guards stood motionless, bagpipes played in low harmony. The royal company of archers took vigil through the night, blades pointed downward, faces set in reverence. The Queen would stay there one night before continuing to London, but in that night, something larger settled in. A shift not just of power, but of mood. A country without its monarch, a family without its matriarch, and a world watching, perhaps for the first time, with shared quiet. Grief is rarely nationalized, but this moment was, and yet it was also intimate, strange, and full of contradictions. In Westminster, preparations intensified. The crown, orb, and scepter were readied for the moment of state. Funeral protocols were updated, speeches drafted, but none of it could recapture those first 24 hours, the sacred slowness of a queen's final day, when history stopped sprinting and walked gently beside her. By the time the Queen's coffin reached London, the city had already changed. Streets were quieter, not because of curfews or official orders, but because the collective rhythm had shifted. People walked slower. They looked up more often. The sound of heels on pavement seemed louder than usual, as if London itself was holding its breath. Buckingham Palace stood in silence, its gates dressed with flowers and handwritten notes, some soaked by rain, others pressed carefully into plastic. Thousands had come, not just to grieve, but to witness the place she once walked, laughed, waved, and stood as an emblem of continuity. People from every background, age, and belief gathered shoulder to shoulder, not in coordinated waves, but in long human lines, drawn together by something they couldn't quite name. That's how grief often works. It doesn't follow rules. It gathers in unexpected places, on benches, in underground stations, along bridges. It becomes the shape of people standing still. And London was full of stillness. Not even the roar of black cabs or the blinking of crossing signs could disturb the sacred pause that had fallen across the capital. At Westminster Hall, the Queen's coffin was placed on the catafalque, surrounded by ceremonial guards, ancient tapestries, and endless silence. People came from across the country to walk past it. Some had queued for 12 hours, others for more than 24, not to speak, not even to kneel, but simply to be in the same room, to see the crown resting atop the coffin, to bow their heads, wipe their eyes, and step slowly forward. What were they mourning? A monarch, yes, but also the end of something else, something older than governments and bigger than any one life, a sense of unbroken time, of tradition that stretched back not just decades but centuries. With the Queen's death, it felt like the 20th century itself had finally closed its eyes. Elizabeth was not only queen during wartime and peace, but during the invention of television, the moon landing, the rise and fall of empires, and the digital age that followed. She had met every U.S. president from Truman to Biden except one. She had hosted Churchill and spoke to Zelensky. She had signed documents with pens and with styluses. The arc of her reign was more than ceremonial. It was tectonic. And so, as people waited quietly in the rain outside Westminster, they weren't just remembering the woman. They were remembering their own lives that had unfolded beneath her watch. A woman held her daughter's hand and whispered stories about the Queen's Christmas speeches. A man removed his hat, even though no one asked him to. A veteran touched his medals with trembling fingers. Some people cried, others smiled, and some did neither. They simply stood, because standing was enough. Meanwhile, inside the palace, every clock was ticking. State arrangements moved forward with exact precision. The royal family met in private, balancing personal loss with public duty. Charles delivered his first address as king, his voice low, steady, but marked with visible grief. He spoke of love, of continuity, of the burden he now carried. But even as the monarchy transitioned on screen, the real transition happened quietly in back halls and side rooms. Staff gathered in break rooms, unsure how to act. Should they smile? Should they serve tea like usual? What do you wear when the Queen dies? There were rules, yes, but emotions don't follow dress codes. Behind the formality of black coats and white gloves, people were processing the loss of someone they had spoken to, laughed with, and admired in deeply personal ways. Meanwhile, in Windsor, preparations began. The Queen would return there for her final resting place. Windsor had always been more than a castle. It was a home. The Queen had spent her weekends there, raised her children in its gardens, and found peace in its quiet rhythm. It was where she had walked her dogs, read her newspapers, and watched the world shift from the edge of history. And now, it would be her final stop. Military rehearsals began at dawn. Routes were cleared. Flowers lined the long walk in massive drifts of color. Tributes from strangers who had never met her, but felt somehow connected. Because the Queen, for all her distance and protocol, had become a kind of thread in the national psyche. Someone people could count on, even if they disagreed with monarchy itself. And in her absence, that thread had loosened. What would Britain become now? What would it feel like to wake up without her presence woven through the fabric of the day? These weren't political questions. They were emotional ones, existential ones, and across the Commonwealth, people asked them in their own ways. In Canada, church bells rang. In Australia, buildings lit up in purple. In New Zealand, flags flew half-mast. In countries once ruled and reshaped by empire, reactions were more complex. Some mourned, others remembered the pain. But even in criticism, there was recognition of the Queen's singular role as a bridge between eras, a steady hand during storms, a quiet face during crises, and now a silence that no crown could fill. Back in London, Westminster Abbey stood ready. It had seen so much: coronations, weddings, funerals. But this would be one of the most watched moments in global history. Presidents, prime ministers, monarchs, and spiritual leaders arrived under gray skies. Helicopters buzzed overhead, streets emptied, screens flickered in homes across continents, and when the procession began, with soldiers moving in perfect rhythm, the sound of marching boots echoed like a heartbeat across stone and time. The coffin, draped in the royal standard, moved slowly, not as an object of ceremony, but as a vessel of memory. Behind it, Charles walked, flanked by his siblings. Their faces were composed, but their eyes carried years. Not just grief, but the realization that nothing would be the same. For them, for the country, for the world. And in that moment, as cameras zoomed in and choirs began to sing, millions of people held their breath, not because of what was happening, but because of what had already passed. In Windsor, the mood was different. Not lighter, not louder, but more intimate. London had felt like the world was watching. Windsor felt like the world had stepped back. The castle grounds, wrapped in thick stone and surrounded by centuries of history, absorbed the weight of what was coming. There were no grand speeches, no announcements, just movement. Quiet, measured, ceremonial. Inside the walls, final preparations were being completed by hands that knew this castle as well as she had. Staff polished surfaces that she had once passed by without notice. Gardens were trimmed, not for display, but out of respect. Even the horses in the royal mews seemed to walk with more restraint. The Queen's coffin would arrive soon, and when it did, Windsor would become the closing page of a story that had stretched across generations. On the long walk, a broad tree-lined avenue stretching toward the castle gates, people gathered again. But this was not London. The crowd was softer, more local. Families with children sat on picnic blankets. Veterans leaned on canes. Elderly women wore brooches shaped like crowns. Some people had driven for hours. Others had walked from nearby towns. They weren't waving flags. They weren't shouting. They were simply present. That's what Windsor invited. Presence. The kind that doesn't need noise to be heard. The Queen had always loved Windsor for that reason. It was her weekend home, her escape, her sanctuary from the noise of governance. And now, in death, she was returning to it, not as a monarch, but as a mother, a grandmother, a widow. Her final journey was lined with people who remembered her for more than just her titles. They remembered her smile during Jubilee parades, her steady voice during lockdown broadcasts, her small gestures that carried great meaning. A woman in the crowd held a Paddington Bear toy, a nod to the Queen's surprise sketch during her Platinum Jubilee, where she shared tea with the fictional bear. It was a moment of levity the public had adored, and now it was a symbol of goodbye. Further down the long walk, a man in a military beret saluted as the procession neared. He didn't speak. His eyes were glassy, his shoulders squared. He had served under her oath, sworn allegiance to her crown, and now he was standing for her one last time. The funeral itself, though televised and watched by millions, was never about spectacle. It was a ritual of endings, ancient, layered, and deeply personal. Inside St. George's Chapel, sunlight streamed through stained glass, casting colored shadows on stone. The architecture, towering, regal, eternal, seemed to hum with memory. Organ music echoed through the air like prayer, and the coffin moved through the aisle with solemn grace. The royal family followed closely, faces drawn, steps steady, emotions tucked carefully behind duty. But if you looked close enough, you saw it. The tightness in Charles's jaw, the way Anne's hands gripped her clutch, the downward tilt of William's gaze. This wasn't just the loss of a sovereign, it was the loss of the woman who had held the family together for nearly a century. The ceremony followed protocol: prayers, hymns, readings, but the most piercing moment came when the crown, orb, and scepter were removed from the coffin, symbols of monarchy lifted away, and suddenly, for the first time in 70 years, Elizabeth II was no longer queen. She was Elizabeth Windsor, a woman, a mother, a soul about to be laid to rest. The Archbishop spoke with reverence, but the silence that followed said more. In that stillness, grief bloomed. It wasn't loud or messy, it was dignified, like the woman it mourned. And then came the lowering, the moment that always feels final, no matter how expected. The coffin, now stripped of regalia, descended slowly into the royal vault. Flowers trembled, eyes brimmed, and in that descent, history moved. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but with gravity. A chapter closed. Outside, bells tolled, slowly, deliberately, as if marking each year of her reign. 70 chimes, one for every year she had carried the crown. And then, just wind, leaves rustling in the trees, a distant bird call, the sound of people exhaling as if they'd been holding their breath the entire time. Later, as the crowd dispersed, there was no rush. No one pushed forward. No one demanded more. They left in silence, in pairs, in small families, holding hands, carrying flowers, leaving behind a trail of footprints on the long walk, evidence that they had been there, that they had stood witness to something rare and irreversible. And as they disappeared into cars and buses and country roads, Windsor remained, steady, stone-faced, silent. It had seen death before, kings and queens, wars and weddings, but this was different. This was the end of an era, a final goodbye not just to a monarch, but to a version of Britain that no longer existed. Back inside the castle, the royal household returned to quiet order. Protocols resumed, guards changed shift, letters of condolence arrived from across the world, and in the quiet corners of private rooms, people wept. Not publicly, not for show, but in the way all great losses demand, slowly, alone, and in fragments. A hand over the eyes, a breath held in a hallway, a whisper into an empty space. The queen was gone, but her presence lingered, in framed photos, in the crease of a cushion she once used, in the way people straightened their backs when passing a portrait. And in time, that presence would fade, gently, but for now it was still there, a ghost not of sorrow, but of legacy, of service, of history that had walked, spoken, and smiled, and then quietly stepped away. If there's one truth that surfaced most sharply in the wake of Queen Elizabeth's final day, it was this: the end of a monarch is never just the end of a person. It is the unraveling of an entire network of habits, relationships, protocols, and emotional scaffolding that had silently shaped a nation's identity. In the days following her passing, Britain didn't just lose a head of state, it lost its North Star. And while newspapers printed tributes and broadcasters adjusted programming to mournful tones, the real shift happened in quieter places. In the hush of school assemblies where teachers tried to explain something timeless to children too young to remember her coronation, in the paused hands of florists arranging lilies for customers who didn't yet have the words to say why they were grieving, and in the routine steps of palace footmen suddenly navigating a world without the woman whose preferences once defined the very rhythm of their work. Buckingham Palace, normally a beacon of royal pageantry, felt subdued. Staff who had worked under her for decades now walked the halls with a new kind of weight, not just mourning, but disorientation. They knew the clocks would keep ticking, the carriages would still roll, the guards would still change, but something fundamental had shifted. The presence that once made those rituals feel sacred was now only a memory. It wasn't about politics, It wasn't about succession. It was about the invisible threads that she had tied together with quiet constancy, the way she greeted people by name, how she preferred her letters arranged on the desk, the dog's food bowls lined up just so, the scent of her favorite hand lotion lingering on a doorknob. Across the Commonwealth, the grief echoed. In Canada, flags flew at half-mast. In Australia, radio hosts spoke in softened voices. In Jamaica, candles were lit in churches that remembered her visits from long ago. It didn't matter if you were Republican or Royalist, something familiar had left the world, and it felt like a silence had been inserted into the global conversation. Even in places once marked by colonial struggle, the mood was more complicated than pure history could explain. Because Elizabeth wasn't just a monarch, she was a constant, a figure who had reigned across the terms of more than a dozen British prime ministers, witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall, met every American president from Truman to Biden except one, and still managed to smile with children who only knew her from cartoons and coins. Her reach had been vast, but her presence, curiously, was always intimate. That was her paradox. Monumental, yet maternal. Distant, yet strangely familiar. So when she passed, people didn't just think of the Queen. They thought of their Queen, the one who always seemed there, unchanging, quietly dependable even when everything else was shifting. And so, in living rooms and parks, people cried. Some cried alone, others in pairs. It wasn't dramatic, it was soft, the kind of grief that arrives in waves, not because of what was lost, but because of what had always been there. In Balmoral, the estate where she had spent her final days, the world's noise never quite reached. That's why she chose it. A place where the air smelled of pine and stone, and the hills rolled into each other like folded cloth. Here, surrounded by her closest staff and a dwindling sense of time, Elizabeth had slipped into death without fanfare. It was said that she had been lucid earlier in the week, even cheerful, but then came the signs. The retreat into bed, the doctors called, the staff told to prepare, and then the waiting. Those who were with her described the stillness as holy, not in a religious sense necessarily, but in the way that deep peace feels sacred, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Outside the castle walls, guards stood motionless, but not cold. Their duty had always been to protect. Now it was to honor. Inside, her beloved dogs were reportedly quiet. Animals have a way of sensing things long before humans admit them. They lay by the doors, not whining, not pacing, just watching, waiting. Somewhere in the halls, a member of the household reportedly played a hymn she loved, not loudly, just enough to be felt. The sound echoed faintly against the stone, folding memory into atmosphere. And when she passed, there were no trumpets, no sudden lights, just silence, the kind that follows only after something deeply important has ended, the kind that feels like the sky itself has paused. Back in London, as the official word came through, operations that had been prepared for decades quietly initiated. Operation London Bridge, the plan for her death, moved into motion, but even that felt surreal, something planned for so long still felt impossible when it arrived. The new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, had only just met the Queen days before. Now she stood before cameras, trying to speak on behalf of a country she had barely begun to lead. The contradiction wasn't lost on anyone, a symbol of stability gone just as political winds grew more chaotic. Across Europe, leaders issued statements. Across the Atlantic, flags were lowered, but no words could match the feeling. Because the truth is, there is no script for the end of an era. There are only reactions, and they are almost always quieter than expected. In hospital wards, old women clutched rosaries and cried. In pubs, toasts were raised in her name. In cathedrals, candles flickered for longer than usual. And in the corridors of her own home, her absence began to settle in like a fog. not heavy, but present. And that presence, or absence, would linger long after the ceremonies ended. It would live in the protocols changed, in the new stamps printed, in the national anthem's new lyrics, and in the millions of small moments where people suddenly realized she was not there anymore. Not waving from the balcony, not speaking on Christmas Day, not watching silently from behind the scenes. The Queen had died. But more than that, a thread had been cut, and whatever replaced it, no matter how noble or dutiful, would not be the same. In the hours that followed her death, a strange choreography unfolded, one rehearsed countless times over decades, but never actually performed until now. Behind palace gates and inside royal offices, the ancient machinery of monarchy turned itself on, slowly, carefully, respectfully. This was not a normal political transfer. It was something older, quieter, and loaded with symbolism that very few living people had ever seen firsthand. Across the United Kingdom and far beyond, time seemed to split. The Elizabethan era was now officially over, and yet it wasn't clear what kind of era would come next. At Balmoral, where her body still lay, the staff moved like they were part of a sacred ritual. Flowers were placed, windows drawn, certain doors were locked. Each action had a script, not one for the public, but one designed to honor a sovereign who had ruled for 70 years. That morning, members of her immediate family had gathered quietly. Some arrived too late to say goodbye. Others stood in silence by her side. There was no crown in the room, no velvet, no orb or scepter, just the soft presence of people who had once called her mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, and were now trying to find the right distance between personal loss and public duty. Outside the gates, word had not yet fully spread, but soon it would. Across 11 time zones, millions would wake up to a headline that changed everything. The Queen has died. It looked like just 5 words, but the weight behind them was immeasurable. In London, royal staff began preparing Buckingham Palace for mourning. Black drapes, special lighting, the flag lowered to half-mast. Within minutes, the official royal website was replaced with a single black screen, bearing her name and dates in white. In train stations, screens that usually announced arrivals and departures now read only, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, 1926 to 2022. The country paused, not just out of respect, but because something this old, this constant, is not supposed to change. For most citizens, she had been on every coin they held, every stamp they mailed, every school book they read. She had met every president, seen every war, signed every law. She wasn't just history, she was the timeline. So how do you process a timeline ending? In Westminster, officials in somber suits followed protocols written long ago. Operation London Bridge, a plan so detailed it included how and when the Prime Minister would be informed, what phrases to use on national television, how to orchestrate the royal funeral over 10 days, even what music would play. But knowing the plan didn't make it feel any more real, because while power was shifting to King Charles III now, emotion was lagging behind, and that's the part no one could script. In small towns, pubs turned their televisions to silent tribute loops. In living rooms, people sat with tea growing cold in their hands, unsure of what they were feeling. For some, it brought back memories of their own grandmothers. For others, it was a strange numbness, the feeling you get when something big happens but hasn't hit yet. And in certain places, there was anger, because for all the Queen represented to some, grace, duty, perseverance, others remembered a different history, one of empire, of colonization, of pain passed down through generations, and this made her death complex. Not everyone grieved the same, not everyone could. In places like India, Kenya, and the Caribbean, reactions were mixed. Sorrow, respect, resentment. For every flower placed at a gate, There were questions asked about what her reign symbolized, what had been done in her name, and what now needed to be re-examined. But still, the day moved forward. Trains kept running, news anchors stayed on air, and Charles, now king, had to step into a role shaped entirely by a woman he could never quite replicate. For decades he had waited. He had endured criticism, public scrutiny, scandal. But now, none of that mattered. His mother was gone, the throne was his, and with that came centuries of tradition, expectations, and unspoken comparisons. In his first official appearance, he didn't wear a crown, he wore grief. His voice slightly trembled, his posture heavy, because while the world saw a new monarch, he still saw the loss of someone who had always been there, and that made every step, every handshake, every statement more difficult. Across the nation, people began gathering at royal residences, not in frenzy, but in quiet numbers. Families brought their children, elderly couples held hands, tourists and citizens stood shoulder to shoulder. They didn't come to cheer, they came to stand, to be present, to feel the weight of a moment that would never come again. And as the hours passed, the tributes grew. Paddington bears, placed by children, teacups, handwritten notes, portraits drawn by students. These weren't the gestures of a political audience. These were human. Because when someone has been part of your emotional architecture for so long, you don't mourn with logic. You mourn with instinct. In Scotland, preparations were made to transport her body to Edinburgh and eventually to London. But nothing moved fast. Every step was deliberate. This wasn't just about respect. It was about allowing the country to adjust, to catch its breath, to understand that something had closed. And even as the palace coordinated media, processions, meetings, and security, they moved slowly, because mourning, at its deepest, can't be rushed. On radio stations, familiar voices cracked. On public transport, strangers were kinder. In schools, children were asked to draw what the Queen meant to them, and the drawings, full of crowns, dogs, and smiling faces, revealed something adults often forget, that presence, even when distant, can still feel personal. Meanwhile, historians began to speak, to frame her life, to explain her reign, to begin the task of telling the story of Elizabeth II as a whole. But even they admitted it would take years to understand her impact fully, because she wasn't just a monarch, she was a mirror. In her, Britain saw its best hopes and its most complicated past. She had lived through war, collapse, rebirth, scandal, globalization, and technological revolution. She had seen the world change, and somehow remained still at its center. And now, that stillness was gone. In the coming days, there would be ceremonies, processions, and pageantry. But this moment, the one immediately after her death, held something different. A kind of pause not found in law or protocol, but in spirit. The sense that something ancient had quietly ended. And though the flag was lowered, and the headlines filled with her name, the truth is, for many people, it didn't hit right away. It crept in later, in a missed Christmas speech, in a changed anthem, in the sound of silence where her voice used to be. The Queen had passed, but grief moves slower than announcements, and even slower than history. As the United Kingdom entered a formal period of mourning, the rest of the world began to absorb the news in waves, like aftershocks following the quiet collapse of something monumental. In cities across the globe, landmarks lit up in purple or dimmed entirely. From Tokyo to Toronto, Sydney to Singapore, the news crawled across screens not with the urgency of breaking tragedy, but with the soft gravity of something that changes the texture of the moment. Governments issued condolences. Presidents and prime ministers released prepared statements. Flags were lowered in former colonies, even where memories of British rule still stirred deep discomfort. It wasn't just the end of a monarch. It was the end of the longest-standing constant in the global imagination. Even in nations with no formal ties to the crown, there was a strange pause, because Queen Elizabeth II had existed as a symbol beyond politics, a kind of ceremonial, still point in a world that spun faster and noisier every year. And now, without her, that stillness was gone. News channels across continents filled the air with archive footage, black and white clips of a young queen waving from balconies, her voice formal but steady, photos of her walking beside world leaders, almost all of whom had passed into history before her. There were interviews, documentaries, timelines, tributes, but what these montages didn't show, and what many viewers felt instead, was a kind of emotional vertigo, a realization that someone who had somehow been there for every war, every peace treaty, every global shift, was simply not anymore. In older generations, this triggered a flood of personal memory. Viewers remembered where they were when she was crowned, when she first visited their country, when they first saw her on TV, or heard her voice on the radio. But for younger audiences, the feeling was different, a strange detachment that made her death feel unreal, because for them, the Queen wasn't a person they had ever imagined not being around. She was like the sky or the moon, something so permanent it didn't seem possible for her to disappear. But disappear she had, and that quiet absence began to shape the emotional atmosphere of the world, even where her power didn't reach. In India, the coverage was cautious. British colonial rule was not distant memory. It was living legacy, and the Queen's image was still bound up in a complex history of empire, resistance, and cultural survival. Still, in places like Mumbai and Delhi, people gathered to talk. Some spoke kindly of her grace and discipline. Others expressed anger that the past had not been more fully addressed during her reign. But in both tones, one truth was shared: the Queen was never ignored. In Africa, the responses were even more layered. In Kenya, where she had first learned of her father's death and her own accession, journalists revisited the moment with both reverence and reckoning. The tree lodge where she had stayed still stood, a site of pilgrimage for royal historians, but now it became a symbol of something else, the moment when a new chapter of monarchy began while the colonial chapter still had not closed. In South Africa, reactions spanned generations. Elders recalled visits and speeches. Youth questioned why the monarchy still carried so much symbolic weight, and yet tributes poured in, from churches, political leaders, even sports teams. Because for all the complexity, the Queen's passing wasn't just about her, it was about the era she represented. In the Caribbean, things were even more tense. Some nations had already begun the process of removing the monarchy as their head of state. Others were preparing referendums, and yet candlelight vigils emerged. People wept. The cognitive dissonance was clear, mourning a figure while simultaneously critiquing the system she symbolized. But that is part of what made her final day so complicated to process globally, because the Queen had somehow existed at the intersection of admiration and ambiguity. She had rarely spoken politically. She had never apologized publicly for empire, but she had also stood as a figure of dignity and tradition in an increasingly chaotic world. Her silence, for better or worse, had been interpreted 1,000 different ways. And now, that silence had turned final. In Europe, the reaction was different. From Paris to Berlin, tributes came with historical weight. Leaders called her the last great link to World War II, the final bridge to a generation that had stood through bombs and recovery, through ruin and reinvention. In France, the Eiffel Tower briefly went dark. In Germany, editorial headlines called her the Queen of Queens. Even in countries with their own royal families, there was a kind of hierarchy. acknowledged that her reign had been the gold standard of monarchy. In the United States, where the monarchy holds no political place but a deep cultural one, the response was massive. All major networks suspended programming to cover the story. American late-night hosts, not known for seriousness, offered sincere monologues. On social media, even those unfamiliar with royal traditions expressed a kind of reflective sadness. It wasn't because they knew her policies. She had none. It was because they felt the shape of the world had changed, and they didn't yet understand what that meant. In Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, nations where the Queen remained the official head of state, the reactions were deeply ceremonial. Parliaments held moments of silence. Prime ministers gave televised addresses. Public services were announced. But even here, the conversations underneath were evolving. What now? Should we continue as before? What does the monarchy mean post-Elizabeth? These were not anti-royal questions. They were existential ones. Because for these nations, the Queen had not just been a symbol. She had been the reason many people had tolerated or even admired the institution. Now, with her gone, the questions could no longer be deferred. And in all these places, with different histories, different scars, different sentiments, one strange detail remained constant. No one quite knew how to talk about the future. The Queen's death had created a silence that echoed beyond protocol. It touched identity, memory, grief, uncertainty. And that kind of silence doesn't end with funerals. It lingers, it waits, it shapes. As her body was prepared to begin its long ceremonial journey from Balmoral to Edinburgh and eventually to London, the world began its own quiet procession. Not with carriages or guards, but with thoughts, conversations, and a collective attempt to understand what had just shifted beneath their feet. There had been no explosions, no crisis, no coup, just a slow, irreversible turning of the page. The kind of page you don't know you were on until it's already been flipped. As the wheels of the black hearse began to turn, beginning the Queen's journey from Balmoral back to London, something rare happened across Britain. A hush settled not just over streets, but within people. This wasn't the silence of shock, or even the stillness of formal mourning. It was deeper. It was ancestral. The kind of quiet that arrives when history starts moving in front of your eyes, not as words in a book, but as physical weight in the air. The Queen's body, carried first through the Scottish countryside, seemed to bring with it a gravitational pull. People lined motorways. Children were lifted onto shoulders. Veterans stood at salute in the middle of roundabouts. Some held flowers. Others just stood with their hands in front of them, as if something sacred was passing that didn't need words. The journey from Balmoral to Edinburgh alone was more than 6 hours, a winding symbolic path through hills and stone villages and narrow roads, and along almost every mile, people waited, not for a spectacle, not for entertainment, but because they sensed something was happening that would never happen again. A queen was returning, not to power, but to memory, and this time, she wouldn't speak. She wouldn't wave. She would simply pass through, allowing others to do the remembering. When her coffin arrived in Edinburgh and was placed in the palace of Holyrood House, a place she had known in life, the architecture seemed to change, not physically, but atmospherically. Suddenly the stone looked older, the carpets quieter, guards didn't move. Even the air inside the palace felt like it was holding its breath. For 24 hours, the Queen lay in rest there, not in Westminster, not in London, but in Scotland, where her reign had ended. Thousands came to file past. Some wept, others bowed, most just stared, because seeing her coffin was different from hearing about her death. It made it real in a way the news couldn't. Real in a way that dissolved the line between private grief and public transition. From Holyrood, she was taken to St. Giles's Cathedral, where the first formal service was held. But even there, It wasn't the pageantry that stood out, it was the restraint. The music was simple, the voices subdued, and the crowd outside the cathedral wasn't just large, it was reverent. Some brought signs, not of protest, but of tribute. Others stood for hours in cold winds just to watch the hearse pass by for 3 seconds. But what lingered most was not what people did. It was how they stood, upright, silent, a nation bracing itself to say goodbye to someone it had never met but somehow always known. As the coffin moved southward the next day, toward London, the quiet ritual repeated again and again. In small towns, elderly women stood with thermoses and blankets. In cities, buses pulled over and went still. Even in villages without television or smartphones, the news had reached, and people came outside simply to stand on the side of the road and face the direction the Queen would come from. When the aircraft carrying her landed at RAF Northolt, it wasn't the sound of engines that echoed. It was the sound of cameras clicking in unison, a mechanical reverence capturing history as it unfolded. Her coffin was then transported through a dimly lit London, past black railings, across bridges she'd crossed in life, until finally she arrived at Buckingham Palace for one final night. There, the crowd was different, bigger, louder in its quiet. You could hear sniffling. People exhaled like they had been holding their breath for a century. And through the palace gates, in that iconic central courtyard, her coffin was visible, lit, centered, still. For a brief moment, the monarch and the palace were one, but even this was temporary. The next day, the Queen was taken to Westminster Hall, the oldest part of the Palace of Westminster, a building older than her monarchy, older than the United Kingdom itself. It was here that she would lie in state, and it was here that Britain would line up, not symbolically, but literally, to say goodbye. The queue was historic, miles long, hours of waiting. Some stood overnight, some came from across the world. It wasn't just about seeing a coffin. It was about being part of something larger than grief, larger than monarchy. It was about being inside history's turning page and leaving your fingerprint on the edge. In line, people shared blankets, passed tea, sang quietly, talked about her Christmas speeches, about how she reminded them of their grandmother, about how they didn't realize how much they'd miss her until now. Parents told children who she was. Teenagers stood without headphones. Some knelt, some prayed. No one pushed. And when the line finally brought them into the hall, into that vast chamber of medieval stone and golden light, almost everyone stopped, because the sight of her there, alone in silence, surrounded by flickering candles and motionless guards, was not just solemn, it was transcendent. It was the kind of scene that makes you forget the time, your phone, your worries. It pressed down on the moment and asked nothing of you but presence. Each person passed her differently. Some bowed, some curtsied, some walked quickly and looked away. Others slowed and met the moment, but all were part of it. That gentle collective goodbye that a country rarely gets to give. Outside, the queue never ended. People were turned away. The wait time grew, but no one complained. Because for many, this wasn't just about the Queen. It was about themselves, about what they had lived through during her reign, about what they were afraid of after, about how the future now felt slightly less certain without her there, quiet, composed, unchanged. And as the days passed and the city began preparing for the formal state funeral, the mood in London wasn't of tension or frenzy. It was a pause. Streets slowed, office lights dimmed earlier, even traffic noise felt dampened. The city was not just hosting an event. It was mourning something foundational, a queen, a symbol, a thread through generations now unspooling into memory. And though the skyline hadn't changed, the buildings, the flags, the weather, something unseen had shifted. The world's most familiar monarch had made her last journey through its streets, and no one who stood along the way would forget what it felt like when she passed. September 19th, 2022, the day the bells tolled across London, not to announce a victory, not to summon citizens to protest or pray, but to signal a goodbye centuries in the making. The Queen's funeral wasn't just a national event. It was a moment the world paused to witness, not because it was grand, but because it was deeply, irreversibly final. From the earliest hours before dawn, people began to arrive, not just to Westminster Abbey, but to the roads, the parks, the railings, anywhere they could be near it. Some had waited all night. Others had flown in from other continents just to be present, not even hoping for a view, but for proximity. As the city's heartbeat slowed to a ceremonial rhythm, there was a quiet choreography unfolding. Guards adjusted their pace. Cameramen whispered instead of calling out cues. Florists laid wreaths with almost prayerful care. And inside the abbey, where monarchs had been crowned and married for centuries, the Queen now arrived not as a sovereign, but as a soul. Her coffin was carried not by machines or lifts, but by hands, and the same pallbearers who had traveled with her from Scotland now trusted to walk each step of history in the world's gaze. The abbey, filled with world leaders, kings, queens, presidents, and diplomats, did not feel like a stage. It felt like a memory about to be sealed. The hymns were chosen by her, the readings whispered in stone. But what lingered most wasn't the sound, it was the weight of the moment. That after 70 years, she was no longer watching history from her throne. She was becoming it. Outside, millions watched, not just across Britain, but across the globe. Some streamed from phones in kitchen corners, others gathered in parks, schools, pubs, and plazas. Even those indifferent to monarchy found themselves watching because the Queen wasn't just a royal figure. She was a presence, a fixture of stability in a world that had spun faster and faster each decade. As the service unfolded, it wasn't the formality that pierced hearts. It was the pauses, the way the Archbishop spoke gently instead of grandly, the way the choir's notes rose not in triumph but in fragile harmony, the way the coffin stood there, still, small in size, yet infinite in meaning. The same woman who had greeted every prime minister since Churchill, who had outlived every global headline of the last century, was now being carried by time, slowly, softly, into memory. The streets outside remained frozen. Tens of thousands stood in complete silence as the service ended and the procession began, from Westminster Abbey to Wellington Arch. It wasn't fast. It wasn't loud. It moved like a tide, steady, inevitable, and surrounded by people who didn't cheer, didn't sing, but simply stood. And when the gun salutes echoed, they didn't break the silence. They deepened it. Each shot was like punctuation in a sentence Britain had been trying to finish for decades. The procession was lined with uniforms, not just British, but from the Commonwealth, Canada, Australia, Kenya, India, soldiers who had never served under any other monarch. Behind them, the royal family walked, heads bowed, steps measured, expressions carved in control. There were no speeches, no eulogies shouted from platforms, just footfall on stone, drums, and a nation watching its symbol return to the earth. As the Queen's coffin reached Wellington Arch and was transferred to the state hearse, the transition became more visible. The ceremonial gave way to the personal. The long journey toward Windsor began, her final destination. But this wasn't just a route. It was a goodbye tour. Crowds gathered at every roundabout, every bend. Children held signs. Elderly citizens waved the same flags they had held at her coronation. Entire neighborhoods poured onto sidewalks. Some stood in silence. Others wept openly, because this wasn't just about Elizabeth the monarch. It was about Elizabeth the thread, the one constant through decades of political storms, cultural shifts, and technological revolutions. And now that thread was being tucked into history, one careful mile at a time. As Windsor Castle appeared on the horizon, the mood began to shift, not to relief, not to closure, but to reverence. The Queen had always been associated with Windsor, not just as a home, but as a refuge. It was where she rode horses, walked dogs, read quietly, and smiled in ways rarely captured in state portraits. It was, in many ways, where she had been most herself. Now she was coming home, not to reign, but to rest. Inside St. George's Chapel, the final service was smaller, more intimate. The grandeur of Westminster gave way to the warmth of carved wood, candlelight, and the echo of sacred walls. As her coffin was slowly lowered into the royal vault, it was not just a ritual, it was a release. The moment Britain had been preparing for all week, all decade, perhaps all reign, had arrived. And there was no speech grand enough, no hymn loud enough, no headline bold enough to capture it. Only silence could. A silence that stretched across the chapel, through the grounds of Windsor, over the nation, and into the homes of millions who realized, all at once, that an era had truly ended. The Queen was gone, and in her place, memory. Not just royal memory, but personal memory. The Christmas addresses, the waving from balconies, the visits during disasters, the steadiness in crisis, the way she never explained but always endured, the way her presence, quiet and consistent, made even the loudest decades feel held. And now that presence had departed, leaving not a void, but a reflection, a space where people were asked not to forget, but to remember gently. And outside, as the sun dipped behind the towers of Windsor, people didn't rush to leave. They stood, sat on grass, lit candles. Some even whispered prayers, not out of religion, but out of gratitude. Because they had lived during her time, they had known her figure, her voice, her gaze. And now they would carry her not in news or history books, but in the quieter rooms of memory, where monarchs become stories, and stories become the soul of a nation. When the Queen was finally laid to rest, the world did not move on. Not yet. Outside Windsor Castle, people lingered long after the cameras were packed away. They sat in folding chairs, stood in small groups, whispered. It was the silence after ceremony that told the deeper story, not the pageantry of state, but the vacuum left behind. For 70 years, Queen Elizabeth II had been more than a monarch. She had been a compass. In homes, in headlines, in hymns sung during crisis. And now that compass had vanished. There was no map for what came next. No guidebook for how to mourn the end of something so long it had embedded itself in the muscle memory of a nation. That evening, the streets of London were unusually still. The rain held off. The sky dimmed slowly. Shop windows kept their tributes, photos of the Queen in black and white, floral crowns, candles flickering in teacups. A few places had switched to Charles's portrait, but most had not. The world was not yet ready to replace her, nor did it know how. In the days that followed, life resumed on the surface. Trains ran, schools opened, Parliament returned, but beneath it all was a strange emotional fatigue. People described it as a floating sensation, like history had shifted, but no one had caught up yet. There was no riot, no collapse, no coup, just a deep, surreal quiet. It was the first time most Britons had ever lived in a world without her, and it felt unreal, like waking from a long, steady dream into a louder, less certain morning. In the Commonwealth, this silence rippled in more complex waves. In countries once ruled by British authority, the Queen had often been a paradox, both symbol of colonization and of quiet dignity. Now, as nations paid their respects, some also asked, what did her passing mean for their future, for their relationship to the crown, for their place in a post-Elizabeth world? Canada held vigils, Australia rang bells, Caribbean nations debated their constitutional ties. In India, older generations remembered her visits, how she navigated ceremony without drama, offering acknowledgement without apology. She wasn't perfect, but she had lasted, and that longevity had created a kind of strange reverence. In Africa, her death opened doors to long-closed conversations about memory, about empire, about forgiveness, about forgetting. Because while the Queen had reigned during decolonization, she had also inherited its aftershocks. Now, with her gone, people weren't just reflecting on her life. They were reopening the history she stood over. What had her silence meant? Was it grace or distance, respect or reluctance? In this global murmur, her absence created both reflection and uncertainty, because for decades she had been the emotional anchor of the crown, and now that anchor was gone. Back in Britain, the royal family entered a new phase. Charles was now king, but even he understood the delicate line he had to walk. His reign began not with fireworks, but with footsteps on eggshells, every word, every gesture, every silence measured against the weight of his mother's shadow. The monarchy didn't just need continuity, it needed redefinition. Could it be as quiet as she had been? Could it evolve without losing the public's quiet trust? These weren't questions that could be answered in days. They would take years, maybe decades. And all the while, a nation was adjusting, not just to a new monarch, but to the first absence of the old one. There were logistical changes, of course, new coins, new stamps. Courtrooms updated their language from Her Majesty's to His Majesty's, but it was the invisible shifts that mattered more, the way people paused when writing the Queen, the way radio hosts hesitated during tributes, the way children asked their grandparents who she really was. These were not just cultural ripples, they were emotional recalibrations, because for many, Elizabeth had been part of the furniture of their lives, not just seen, but assumed. Like Big Ben, like the Union Jack, like the weather. And now she was not. In places like Balmoral, the absence was more physical. Her dogs no longer padded down the stone halls. Her horses no longer grazed the same fences. Staff members moved more quietly. The rhythm of the estate changed, not drastically, but deeply, because her presence had always been rooted in routine. Breakfast at 8, walks at 10, letters reviewed by noon. These rhythms were now gone, and in their place was something harder to name, a stillness that felt heavier than silence. The Queen's death also marked something broader, the fading of the World War II generation. She had been the last global leader directly tied to that era, the last who had served during it, lived through it, spoken to its survivors as one of them. Her passing wasn't just the end of a reign, it was the closing of a chapter in human memory, a chapter written in ration stamps and telegrams, in blackouts and coronation crowds, in radio speeches and balcony waves. And now, that chapter had no living narrator. This is perhaps why her death felt so personal to so many, because it marked not just the loss of a monarch, but the disappearance of a time when the world still believed in certain kinds of duty, of service, of silence. In the Queen, people had seen not just a leader, but a symbol of a different kind of public life, one not built on charisma, but on constancy, not on drama, but on durability. And Now that symbol was gone. What would fill its place? Would anything? As newspapers shifted their headlines and screens returned to regular programming, something lingered, a kind of historical homesickness, a realization that we were not just moving on, but moving away from a world where Elizabeth II existed as both presence and metaphor. She had reigned through Cold Wars and tech booms, through Diana and Brexit, through the Beatles and 9/11, and now she was gone. And with her, the quiet center many didn't realize they depended on. The monarchy, of course, would continue. The pageantry would persist. Crowns would still shine and parades still march. But the emotional chemistry had changed. The Queen had been the still water, the gravity at the heart of a spinning country. And now, that gravity had shifted. In the silence that followed her burial, Britain was left not just with questions about the monarchy, but with questions about itself. Who were they without her gaze, without her example, without her annual addresses, her silent stoicism, her carefully chosen brooches that meant more than speeches ever could? These were questions no prime minister could answer, no heir could resolve. They had to be lived through, slowly, quietly, just as she had lived. And as the nation faced that stillness, the only thing to do, for now, was to walk forward, gently, carefully, into a world no longer watched over by the woman who had done so for longer than anyone else alive. The days turned to weeks, and the weeks into months, and still something felt unfinished. Britain had buried its queen, mourned her with candles and broadcasts and pageantry, and yet the mourning didn't end. It lingered in small gestures, in uncertain silences, in the spaces where routine used to be. Not because people didn't know how to move on, but because they didn't want to move past something that had been so silently constant for so long. It wasn't grief in the traditional sense. It was something quieter, more disorienting, like waking up and realizing that a landmark you'd never noticed before was suddenly gone, and now you couldn't stop noticing its absence. For many, Elizabeth II had been a mirror, not of who they were, but of who they tried to be. She didn't boast. She didn't overreach. She endured. And in a world saturated with noise, her silence had become a form of comfort, a kind of emotional scaffolding. And now, with her gone, people were left standing without that structure, unsure if the house would still hold. Teachers felt it in classrooms when explaining monarchy to students who now had no memory of a queen. Veterans felt it in parades where her portrait no longer led the march. Even comedians who once relied on her stoic image as a cultural shorthand found that the joke now landed differently. Because she wasn't just a figurehead, she had become a shape inside British identity, something stitched into the fabric so deeply that pulling it out changed the entire pattern. And perhaps the strangest part of all was that no one quite knew how to talk about it. There was no national conversation, no shared agreement on what her death meant. Some people saw it as a historical turning point. Others saw it as an emotional wound. Many weren't sure what they felt, only that something invisible had shifted. And so the country drifted, not into chaos, not into crisis, but into a quiet recalibration, a reassessment not just of monarchy, but of memory itself. Because, with Elizabeth gone, the past began to feel more fragile, more unreachable, like the thread between then and now had frayed slightly, and in that space, questions emerged. What had she truly stood for? What had she held together? And now that she was no longer here, what would hold in her place? At Balmoral, where she had spent her final hours, the air changed. The rooms were still grand, still tidy, still steeped in history, but the warmth was different. Staff noticed the difference in the light, in the stillness, in the way guests walked the halls, more reverent now, more hushed. Some came to feel close to her memory. others came to feel close to their own, to the version of Britain that seemed to live inside those walls, unshaken by time. And while the castle remained open, a sort of sacredness had crept in, not declared, not spoken, but felt, like something final had been left behind in those stone corridors, something that didn't rise again. Meanwhile, Charles continued his new reign with caution. He made appearances, gave speeches, smiled in the way that royals must, but his face, older, more lined than his mother's ever seemed to be, reminded the public of something else. The monarchy was aging, not just in faces, but in purpose. It raised a subtle question: how long can something ancient remain relevant by simply continuing to exist? Elizabeth had made it work through restraint, through mystery, through the discipline of not needing to be loved in order to be respected. But in a world that now demands visibility, vulnerability, accessibility, could the next generation do what she did by doing the opposite? Or would the very nature of monarchy have to change to survive her absence? These weren't headlines. They weren't breaking news. They were questions whispered in documentaries, muttered in pubs, explored in classrooms. Not accusations, not criticisms, just a quiet curiosity, seated by her passing, because for the first time in decades, people weren't just looking at the crown. They were looking under it, trying to understand not what it stood on, but what it stood for. And in the background of all this, life continued. Crowds gathered for royal weddings, for state visits, for Christmas broadcasts. But the energy was different, softer, less enchanted, as if the country was still wearing black beneath its red, white, and blue. Because mourning doesn't always wear a face. Sometimes it becomes a tone, a slowness, a subtle melancholy beneath celebration. For the royal family itself, this was perhaps the most difficult terrain. They had always existed within a strange contradiction. Their lives were public, but their emotions were private. And now, those two forces collided more forcefully than ever. Cameras watched, their every move, analyzing whether grief had aged them, hardened them, softened them, and yet none of them could fully grieve in public, because the Queen's death had not just taken a mother or grandmother. It had taken the one person who truly understood the weight of their roles. Her absence created a loneliness that no title could fill, a vacancy of understanding, a reminder that even among royalty, there are sorrows that cannot be shared. And this tension echoed outward, into the press, into politics, into culture. In newspapers, columnists began to write about the Elizabethan age in past tense. In Parliament, ministers referenced her reign as a measure of stability. In art, galleries, and bookstores, retrospectives emerged, not about monarchy, but about time, about legacy, about what we carry when a symbol dies, because that's what she had become in the end, not just a monarch, but a symbol of steadiness, of poise, of an era that could no longer be revisited except in memory. And in this way, her death was not just the end of a life, it was the loss of a language, a way of being that had outlived empires, movements, and revolutions, and yet never demanded center stage. The Queen had always been more background than spotlight, more whisper than shout, and in her absence, the world suddenly realized how loud her silence had been. That is what was hardest to explain. Not what she did, but what she allowed others to believe in. She wasn't a savior. She wasn't a revolutionary. She was a still point in a turning world. And when she left, that stillness left with her. Not replaced, not replicated, just gone. And in the quiet that followed, people began to hear themselves differently, not through the echo of her voice, but through the absence of it, as if Only now, they were beginning to understand what she had meant, not by action, but by being, just being. And that is the weight of certain legacies. They cannot be reenacted. They can only be remembered, slowly, softly, and always in silence. Grief doesn't follow the rules of calendars. It doesn't end with a funeral or fade with each passing month. It lingers in odd places. A newspaper folded a certain way, a phrase someone once said, a chair never moved since it was last used. And for Britain and much of the world, the passing of Queen Elizabeth II was not something anyone got over. It was something they adjusted to, slowly, uneasily, like someone living in a house that has lost its roof, but still stands. The emotional blueprint of a nation had been altered. Something constant had been quietly erased, and now everything felt a little more temporary, a little more vulnerable. Even for those who had long questioned the monarchy or opposed its traditions, her absence still felt significant, not because of her power, but because of her presence. She had become the backdrop of time itself, and when a backdrop vanishes, even the familiar scenes begin to look different. There were no new wars that day, no fires, no collapse of power, just a transfer, but it felt like more than that. It felt like the air itself had changed, as if, in her final breath, the country had lost its last uninterrupted line to a century that was no longer recoverable. Not the wars, not the victories, not the rituals. A sense of endurance, of composure through chaos, was gone. And what remained was the question no one wanted to speak aloud. What happens to a nation when the person who defined its restraint disappears? The media, for its part, eventually moved on. Headlines returned to politics. Scandals reappeared. Elections surged and faded. But underneath it all, her absence hummed, not loud enough to disrupt, just strong enough to remind. In the days that followed her funeral, you could still see people pausing before portraits, children tracing her face on old coins, tourists snapping photos outside Buckingham Palace, not to celebrate, but to document that they had once stood where she once stood. Not far from the gates, small stands continue to sell her likeness, not as memorabilia, but as memory. And each item, each postcard, seemed to whisper the same thing. She was here, she mattered, and now she doesn't return. Inside Balmoral, the changes were subtle. Curtains remained drawn. Clocks were checked less frequently. The staff adjusted not only to a different resident, but to a different rhythm, one that lacked the quiet insistence of routine that the Queen had brought. Her early breakfasts, her long walks, her handwritten notes, these rituals had anchored the estate, and now, in their absence, the building felt like a place trying to remember how to breathe on its own. There are places like that, places haunted not by tragedy, but by discipline. And when the discipline leaves, it takes the spirit with it. Her dogs, once symbols of her gentleness, were passed along to family. They walked different gardens now, followed different footsteps. But there was no replacing the voice they once knew, no recreating the cadence of her hand upon their fur. And that is how grief often hides, in small creatures that look the same but behave differently, in gestures we forget meant something, and in traditions that no longer feel alive once their origin is gone. Charles stepped into his role with visible intent, but even he, the longest waiting heir in history, could not summon her gravity. His reign would be different, necessarily so. But that difference came with a risk. Because the Queen had never had to ask for loyalty, it had been granted to her through time, through mystery, through sheer consistency. Could a modern monarch, in a modern world, generate the same trust through visibility, through openness? Or would the very act of being seen too clearly weaken the illusion of royalty itself? These were not questions for newspapers. They were questions for late-night thoughts, for private worries, for the quiet places where legacy is weighed not in headlines, but in echoes. The Commonwealth, too, began to shift. Some countries questioned their ties. Others reaffirmed them. But in each debate, her name was invoked, not as leverage, but as memory, because it was her presence, not just the institution, that had once stitched distant nations together. And now, with her gone, the threads felt looser. The map looked the same, but the meaning behind its borders flickered. Because when you remove the person who held the tone steady, the notes begin to wobble, not from conflict, but from uncertainty. And that is what her death truly ushered in, not chaos, but the slow surfacing of questions too long deferred, about relevance, about identity, about whether tradition alone can carry meaning into the future. And in those months after her passing, those questions didn't explode. They unfolded gently, unavoidably, like cracks spreading through ice. The crown remained, the ceremonies continued, but the spirit, the stillness that once made it all feel timeless, had been buried with her. And in that space, the country was left not with despair, but with deliberation. What kind of monarchy would this be, now that the one who embodied its silence had gone silent herself? Across the world, people who had never lived in Britain felt something too, because for all her limitations, for all her critics, Elizabeth II had come to represent something broader than royalty. She had become a symbol of grace under pressure, of composure in a world that often screamed. And when she vanished, so too did a kind of mirror, one that had let people believe that dignity could still exist on a public stage, that a human could still serve without spectacle, that steadiness could still be a virtue. And so her passing wasn't just the end of a reign, it was the end of a way of being, a tempo, a temperature, a worldview held together not by policy, but by posture. And now, in her absence, the world was left to ask, what do we carry forward from a life lived so deliberately and so quietly? That question will not be answered in this generation, maybe not in the next, because some legacies aren't meant to be decoded, only absorbed, slowly, softly, and when the time is right, remembered.